far-off country they came to fight and conquer and perhaps to die in a remote corner of the British Empire in a conflict that has become known as the Boer War. While it lasted, the battles were fierce, the roar of the cannon deafening, the shouts of the dying pitiful, the pain of loved ones left behind real. But the big guns have long since fallen silent. The dry African veldt has soaked up the blood of friend and foe alike. The dead have been buried, memorials erected, and the stories about this war told to grandchildren. Yet this conflict 100 years ago still has lessons to teach to new generations, simply because it was not a war fought clearly between good and evil, but because two overtly and confessing Christian nations took part in it.
I think that's something that's often ignored by writers about the war. They tend to forget that the war fundamentally was an ethical issue, and people had strong views about the righteousness of the war. And many, for example, many British soldiers went believing that the war was actually a righteous war, and many Boer soldiers fought the war against an imperial enemy because they felt God was on their side. And so in a certain sense, God was in both trenches, if you like.
Naming this war has proven to be problematic for historians, because in many instances the names chosen do not reflect the full scope of participants or the all-encompassing nature of the conflict. It is diversely called by historians the South African War, the Anglo-South African War, the Anglo-Boer War, the Second War of Independence, and so on. However, this conflict was between Great Britain and all the people of the Boer republics, black and white. There are many causes given for this war, but in essence it was a conflict which had its origins in the Boers striving to liberate themselves from the cultural and political domination of Great Britain. The Boers moved from the Cape Colony further into the interior of South Africa and established independent republics. Initially, this was tolerated by the British Empire, but after the discovery of gold in 1886, British supremacy was seen to be threatened by a powerful and affluent Boer state, and staunch imperialists like Milner wanted to curb Boer power and, of course, gain access to the massive gold deposits. Against this colonial aggression, the Boers resisted in a conflict which truly marks the start of an African nationalism and anti-colonialism which in the century to come would sweep throughout Africa. What makes this conflict on the plains of Africa even more interesting, notwithstanding the fact that it was the first modern war with a host of nations participating, or a war in which guerrilla warfare was developed, or where trenches and aerial photography were used for the first time, dum-dum bullets and concentration camps utilized extensively, is the fact that it was a war in which religion and religious aspects played a major role. At the turn of the century, new communication technology and the advent of moving film gave the war in South Africa an immediacy to the public as no other war effort ever before had achieved. But reactions to it differed from open support to a severe anti-war sentiment. Many clergy from the Anglican Church openly supported the war, like the Bishop of Bath.
Of the greatness of our mission in South Africa, one need have no doubt. One thing stood out clearly and nobly: the patience, the Christian patience with which our government had of late been striving after peace when the blundering Boers had done so much to provoke them.
There were also opposing views.
The anti-war movement was quite large, but lacked influence. It didn't really have much support in the high echelons of government. You find Joseph Chamberlain, for example, virtually dismissing the hundreds of resolutions sent by Protestant denominations to the Colonial Office complaining about the war and suggesting that Britain should not be involved in that war. He dismisses them. In fact, in one of his memos, he says this is unimportant. We have the groundswell of opinion in our favor. We have the Anglicans on our side mainly, and there didn't seem to be any fear that the anti-war movement would unsettle the British enterprise.
The Quakers, for instance, were on the whole anti-war. They were anti-war because they were pacifists, and many of them became involved in humanitarian work to help the Boers during the war. The Church of England on the whole supported the establishment. There were a few individuals who did not. They tended to be cried down by the rest as far as possible. Generally, other religious groups were split straight down the middle. The Methodists, for instance, there were some who were very principled and took the line that these people should have the right to do things their own way and that the war was an immoral war. And there were those who took the line that the British had every right to defend their own in South Africa. So there was no consistency. The Baptists, in general, took the line that took the pro-Boer line, were not happy about the war. But again, some more than others. It was not a consistent pattern. I think, generally speaking, you could say that religious groups, then as now, were very split over the war.
So I think one must separate anti-war from pro-Boer. There were very few. There were a few who, in fact, simply felt that the Boers had a moral right to a victory. In other words, they were on the moral high ground and Britain had actually transgressed an ethical law. But they were a very tiny, tiny minority. Most anti-war Christians simply believed that there shouldn't have been a war and that Britain had no right to wage war in South Africa, and that having begun the war, they should end the war as soon as possible.
However, many Christians, while informed about the war in general, were deprived of detailed knowledge, including the terrible atrocities committed during the war.
The press reports were heavily censored, but some press reporters did manage to bring back reports of what was going on. There was a reporter for the Morning Leader, a gentleman called John McKinnon Robertson, who actually winds up in the British government in the later Edwardian years. He was a secularist and went to South Africa as a reporter for the Morning Leader. And he was one of the first people who was able to tell the British public about the indiscriminate burning of farms. And he took some lantern slides, which he brought back, and was one of the first people to actually show the provinces of Britain that there were atrocities being committed in South Africa in the name of the king and in the name of the empire.
I think a lot of people almost wanted to disregard that. They didn't want to believe that that was actually happening. And the huge propaganda machine that was at the disposal of the British government meant that I think the ordinary person had no idea about the suffering in concentration camps. Remember that although this was the war when we first had photographic coverage and that kind of thing, we're still talking about a print media. And I think the general person in the pew was obviously getting a mediated view of what was going on. And I think ministers didn't want to come to terms with the atrocities of concentration camps.
In England, word about the appalling conditions in the concentration camps was played down by clergy, like the Bishop of Liverpool.
The Boer women and children were crowded into camps because they simply could not be kept alive any other way. The great mass of evangelical Christians in Great Britain will continue to support the policy of their government.
However, humanitarians like Emily Hobhouse revealed the atrocities of the war.
No, she was not a Quaker. And had no connections with the Quakers. And the Quakers didn't, in fact, terribly much approve of her. They felt she was too political.
Quaker efforts to publicize the atrocities of the war were enormous. So somebody like Joshua Rowntree was very influential in that way. And, of course, they took up the work of people like Emily Hobhouse, who herself was actually an Anglican. But whose work was widely distributed in nonconformist circles, particularly through the auspices of the Quakers, who, because of their financial resources, were able to put money behind the anti-war movement.
And of course, during the war, the Cadbury family took over financial control of one of the liberal newspapers, the Daily News. And the Daily News, which had been an imperial newspaper up until then, became very pro-Boer after the Cadbury takeover. So that was significant, because up until then there had only been one newspaper in London which was pro-Boer, and that was not a newspaper which was read by the people who mattered. It was a newspaper called the Morning Leader.
And that is why Quakerism enjoyed a significance way beyond its numbers, because if you're looking at how many adherents there were in Britain or South Africa, one's talking about a handful in relation to the other denominations. But their influence crept into many nonconformist church periodicals. And in fact, they were able to launch an enormous campaign to conscientize the larger British population about what was actually happening in the war. I think the trouble is that the military and the government managed to give a sanitized version of the war to the public. And it was only dissenting nonconformist church magazines that in many ways got some of the stories from the field, so that people understood the civilian casualties in the war through the sponsorship of people like the Quakers.
One terrible irony of the religious opposition against the war in Europe was that it was not Christians who objected on moral grounds against the war, but that very real and vociferous opposition came from the atheist movement, which was very active at the time.
There were many cartoon depictions of the war and its consequences, and I have one here that might be of interest. This is from a newspaper called The Truth Seeker, which is quite interesting because most of its output was extremely flippant. It's almost like a sort of private eye for the period. But this is a very, very serious cartoon, and what it actually depicts is how some anti-religious groups in Britain believed that the whole war was being underpinned by religion. It's often been said that many people who supported, who were against the war, were pro-Boer. In some respects that isn't true, because if you look at this cartoon, it demonstrates that they were not so much pro-Boer as anti-war, and anti the idea of an imperial war being prosecuted by Christianity.
Both Kruger and John Bull are stabbing at each other with instruments inscribed with religion. The flags claim to have God on their side. The trumpeters proclaim love for Jesus, and the British are fighting the Boers with Salvation shells, and the Boers are shooting back with Christian cartridges.
The message is not so much the Boers are right, the British are wrong, or even the other way round, but all of war is wrong, and all of war is wrong supported by, aided and abetted, and promoted by Christianity.
That experienced the war intensely was the Jewish community of about 10,000 who were living in the Boer republics at the time the war broke out. They were located mainly in Johannesburg and had mostly immigrated to South Africa from Eastern Europe and Germany after the discovery of gold in the 1880s. In general, they had good relations with the Boers, although there were some on the Boer side who ascribed the war to the economic and financial influence of the Jews.
Well, it was a welcoming society, because Paul Kruger set the tone of this welcome. He was personally friendly with a number of leading Jewish businessmen, most notably with Sammy Marks, also with people like Barney Bonato and Edward Lippert. And this, in fact, became a political issue. Eugene Moret, who at the time was the editor of London Folk, used Paul Kruger's intimate friendships with some of these Jewish businessmen as a stick with which to beat President Kruger.
The reaction of the Jews to the war differed widely, and especially those in rural areas chose to stay on. But the majority of Jews living in Johannesburg left the Boer republics for the coastal areas. Some even left the country. However, there was a marked exception, the wealthy businessman Sammy Marks, a remarkable figure who, as Jew, remained neutral during the war, nurturing friendship with both Boers and the British, and who played a major part in the eventual peace negotiations. He lived just outside of Pretoria, and during the war his house was open to both Boer generals and the English forces. Marks was a good friend of President Paul Kruger and made no efforts to conceal it. He maintained his neutrality throughout the war, was well respected by both sides, and after the war helped a great deal in the reconstruction initiatives. However, in England, the large Jewish immigrant population of about 140,000 generally supported the war effort.
the war was, in fact, welcomed by this Jewish community, not because they were militaristic or martial. It was welcomed as an opportunity by them to demonstrate to the society as a whole how patriotic they were. Jews had been the subject of all sorts of accusations in British society: lack of patriotism, lack of commitment to the society, not English, not assimilable into the society. And the Jewish leadership felt was an opportunity, the Jewish elite felt was an opportunity to demonstrate just how patriotic the Jews were. And the lead in British society was taken by the chief rabbi of Britain, somebody called Herman Adler, who composed a war prayer, which he instructed was to be read in synagogues throughout the British Empire. And his lead was followed by his subordinate rabbis, some of whom before the war had had serious moral qualms, serious ethical qualms about the justice of British behavior in South Africa. But they chose to muffle their own dissent. They chose, in fact, to follow the chief rabbi's lead on this matter.
The Jewish population in England also supported the war effort by contributing generously to the various war funds. And because the immigrant population wanted to secure their position in their newly adopted country, they participated on a significant scale in the war in order to show their loyalty. This involved many young Jewish men joining the army as recruits.
Now, what's interesting about that, of course, is that you have Jews signing up to fight for Britain in England and, of course, in South Africa and the Cape, and also in Australia and Canada. But you also have Jews fighting on the other side. There's a significant number of Jews, Boer, who join the Boer commandos and who fight on the other side. And there are occasions, which I've seen recorded, where you have Anglo-Jewish soldiers standing guard over Boer prisoners who are Jewish and who suddenly recognize or realize, perhaps through conversation, that they are both Jewish. So you have Jews participating freely on both sides.
It is rather remarkable to note the absence of coverage of the war in Jewish circles, but this probably has to do with the lack of opposition the Jewish population showed against the war in South Africa. But politically, it would have been unwise for them to take an ethical position against the war.
And what struck me about its coverage of the war, which was very extensive indeed, was the absence of engagement with the moral crises that the war produced. I'm thinking here of Kitchener's methods of barbarism, in which he destroyed Boer farmhouses, slaughtered their animals, and drove women and children into these camps. And camps where we know the casualty rate was fearsome and quite appalling, where the conditions were appalling. And here are major sort of moral issues which should be engaging religious communities, which should be engaging theologians. And what struck me about the coverage, and I was looking for this sort of commentary, was precisely the absence of such commentary, was the silence around such issues.
Although neither the Boers nor the British had a formal discussion on the matter, there was a sort of tacit agreement that it would be a white men's war, and they did not want to involve the black population. However, this proved naive, for soon black people were intensely involved on both sides. This is one of the aspects of the war that has been neglected by past historiography, and it is only recently that the full impact of black involvement in the war has been fully appreciated. With the outbreak of the war, blacks first participated on both sides in non-fighting capacities as caretakers of animals, wagon drivers, and as achterrijers, or henchmen.
Pretty soon, the British realized that they could make use of armed blacks, and armed blacks started to accompany the British columns as spies, and then as fighters. So eventually, there were probably about 30,000 armed blacks in the British Army, apart from blacks in the tribal areas who were pro-British because they were anti-Boer, and who were keeping Boer forces out of their territory, which made the operational terrain of the Boers much smaller.
This made it difficult, even impossible, for the Boers to continue with the guerrilla war. And in this sense, black people had a significant influence on the outcome of the war.
But then there's also the fact that not only were blacks a threat to the Boer cause, they were also assisting, collaborating with the Boer cause, as these achterrijers were. And there were individual groups who were striving for power within their own community, and therefore being against the side who was pro-British. A very difficult situation. Black participation in a way can be seen as black pawns in the white man's game, really, as one of the historians mentioned.
Religion and religious beliefs at the turn of the century were a significant factor to reckon with. In both England and South Africa, religion was still to a large extent a structuring factor in society. And while in many instances religion was not overtly visible in events, it permeated society and determined people's lives and decisions.
One should understand that at the time of the Anglo-Boer War, politics for the Afrikaner was cut from the same cloth as religion. And this meant that you had two sides of one coin, religion and Afrikaner nationalism. And it very often became the situation where it was even seen that being unfaithful to the Afrikaner cause was to be unfaithful to God. And once when President Steyn, a highly respected person of whom you wouldn't expect this, said that the real elect were the bitter enders, he was rebuked by a Dominee Burger of Middelburg.
We make the mistake, of course, of homogenizing Boers. We tend to think of them as a collective, just as we think of the British as a collective. And in fact, there were different traditions of Boer belief, not least of all amongst the rival Protestant traditions within the Dutch Reformed Church. So one shouldn't forget those intersecting differences. The pietism, for example, of some versus the Calvinism of others.
Did the Afrikaner of the Anglo-Boer War regard himself as part of the chosen people? The answer is no, not really. This was a 20th century notion, especially from the 1930s onwards. But it started just before or round about the Anglo-Boer War, was nurtured there and taken further on. During the war, we find that it was perhaps more a vocation that was seen, that God was on their side, that they were fighting a cause that was just and holy.
One reason for this attitude towards the war was the fact that Boer society at the turn of the century was deeply religious and inevitably interpreted major events in religious terms, or at least based their views of such events on religious considerations.
Quite clearly there was a wide range, a wide spectrum of thought about religion, from the extreme piety and a spiritual commitment right through to indifference, apostasy, hypocrisy. And as the war continued, there was definitely a deepened religious fervor amongst the men, especially amongst the bitter enders. And this can be seen with special commandos where officers like Boers were in command. That also brings us to the fact that you had basically, therefore, the vast majority being sincerely religious, earnest with their faith, and believing that God was their savior and that they were followers of Christ. But then there was the other side of the story, the apostasy and hypocrisy. You know, you get incidents like men being indifferent, a chap tearing out a page from the Bible, from the book of Revelation, and rolling a cigarette and then saying, I know how to enjoy the revelation.
In addition to this kind of indifference, a number of atrocities were also committed on the Boer side, as an incident at the mission station Lelyfontein in Namaqualand shows. In 1902, under Smuts' leadership, Mani Maritz and a contingent of Boers decided to establish a base in Namaqualand from where to attack Cape Town itself. For this to succeed, they had to ensure that the local black population centered around the mission station at Lelyfontein did not contact the British. Therefore, Maritz and his men assembled them in the square near the church and read a proclamation that the British were to receive no word of their presence in Namaqualand.
The local leader of the black community refused to accept the proclamation, and Maritz, in a rage, first of all, threw a plough against the side wall of the church. He was a big, strong man, and then threw the leader against it, and I think he quite severely injured him. The black community had prior knowledge that Moritz and his men were coming and had decided that they were going to make a stand. And when Moritz and his men left Lillefontein, there's a very steep defile as you go out of the town, the little town. And as he and his men went along that defile, there were members of the black community on top throwing stones down and shooting at them with their old blunderbusses, and they managed to kill quite a few of Moritz's men. Moritz went away. They knew that he would come back because he would not stand for such behavior from these people. They sent their wives and children away to safety, and then they waited for him to come back. I think he came back about 3 or 4 days later with reinforcements and Mausers against their old blunderbusses, and he murdered the lot of them. And then went away. It shocked even other Boers that he went quite to those lengths.
Of course, atrocities were not only committed on the Boer side, and surely one of the saddest chapters in the history of the Boer War was the program introduced by Kitchener to systematically burn down farms, kill all livestock, and put the women and children in concentration camps. It is significant to note that a large number of churches were also burnt down.
Churches were burned down by the British for probably 2 reasons. One being that they had this scorched earth policy to burn down the possessions of the Boers in order for the Boers to lay down their arms. Now, very often the burning of a church was part of the burning of a town, like, for instance, Bothaville in the Orange Free State. Together with that, the British soldiers must have had a notion that politics and religion were very closely linked for the Boers, and they saw that as a main reason for the Boer resistance, in which they were correct. An example of that is that Lord Milner, after the Anglo-Boer War, broke down the church on Church Square in Pretoria because he saw this as a bastion of Afrikaner nationalism, in which again he was correct. But there was also the incident that the Anglican church in Lindley was burned down by the British soldiers. And once again you can say this is clear destruction. They were on the rampage, and burning means let's go on. And this scorched earth policy very often went out of control.
The scorched earth policy also necessitated the concentration camps, since women, children and black farm workers had nowhere else to go. Concentration camps were also used in the Spanish-American War of 1897, but not on the scale of that of the Boer War. Conditions in the concentration camps for both blacks and whites were appalling, with an horrific death rate. Rumors were also rife that the British deliberately attempted to poison many women, children and black people in the camps.
I think one has to remember that at this time, although medicine had improved greatly, they still really didn't have cures for things like measles. So the women saw their children going into the hospitals and dying, wasting away and dying, sometimes over months. And they feared that it was the hospitals and the treatment that they received in the hospitals which led to this. And this gives rise to these rumors about poisoning, or that there was something going on that contributed to the deaths of their children. If one looks at what happened to the British soldiers and the medical care and the conditions under which British soldiers in the war had to live, and a number of people have discussed this, one can see that what was happening to the women was really what was happening to the soldiers as well. The military were pretty careless of life, and this carries through until the First World War, when they used the soldiers just as fodder for the war. So I think it comes out of war rather than out of deliberate policy.
The piety of the women during the war was based on the fact that they were the good people and the English were the bad people. But they saw the English only as an instrument in God's hand to punish them for their personal sins. They were never helped to believe that sin is also prevalent in structures in war itself, and that sin can be something bigger than just your personal sins. And that was why the woman couldn't cope. They thought that, they should relate the war to their personal sins, while the sin was actually in the war itself and in imperialism and in the atrocities going with war.
Amongst the suffering and hardship of the camps, one figure stands out clearly: Emily Hobhouse, who really took the plight of the people in the camps seriously, and not only helped them, but also brought word about the existence of the camps to the attention of the public.
In many senses, she's a crucial figure. She didn't go to all of the camps. I think one must remember that. She came out, got as far as the Free State, and visited some of the Free State camps. She was never allowed into the Transvaal. And the second time she came back, she wasn't even allowed to leave the ship, step onto the shores of Southern Africa. But she became the symbol of a woman who cared for the Boers, and above all, who cared for the Boer women. So she was crucially important in mobilizing public opinion in England. And it's really as a result of her reports and her criticisms that the British began to take some actions over the camps.
Emily Hobhouse published a number of books, the first called The Brunt of the War, in which she publicized the plight of Boer women during the Boer War. Another major publication was War Without Glamour, published during the First World War.
And that book is quite interesting because Emily Hobhouse was a pacifist. She believed passionately that war was evil and that the people who suffer in war are the innocent, and particularly the women and children. So what she did in that book was to publish the testimonies of numbers of Boer women, and in doing so she was universalizing the Boer experience. She was saying that the Boer experience is not just important for the Boers, it's important for the world at large. If we're going to talk about hope, reconciliation, peace, we can begin to understand it through what happened to these women.
During the war, many colorful characters served as ministers of religion for the Boers. People such as Abraham Kriel, who after the war founded many orphanages for Boer children. Dominee H.S. Bosman was the Dutch Reformed Dominee of the church on Church Square. He had an assistant, Hendrik van Broekhuizen, who in 1900 served in Dani Tron's elite squad during the week and on Sundays preached from the pulpit in Pretoria. In the Free State, another Dutch Reformed minister, Paul Roux, eventually became a general and was captured and sent to Ceylon. And there, together with a certain Dominee Alheit, he looked after the spiritual needs of the imprisoned burghers until the war was over. Another extremely well-known figure was that of John Daniel Kestel, who was of Scottish origin and who became a very influential church leader in South Africa in the 20th century. He was renowned during the war for not hesitating to risk his own life to help the wounded on both sides during battle, and the English actually erected a memorial to him.
He was part of a so-called triumvirate, an unofficial triumvirate, with President Steyn of the Free State being the political leader, General de Wet being the military leader, and Kestel being the spiritual leader. And he had great sympathy for the burghers and commander. His own son died during the war, was killed. And this man really in the 20th century became an important figure for the spiritual needs of the Afrikaner, and together with that, with the awakening of Afrikaner nationalism.
I think also one must remember that some Boer preachers were not persuaded that the war was a good idea either. There's a notion that suggests that all Boers were in favor of the war, all Boer ministers were, and that the Dutch Reformed Church had no kind of questioning outlook at all. That's not true. For example, J.A. du Plessis at Lindley was well known for his views. He said, for example, that Boers should in fact surrender because there was nothing to be gained by taking on the empire. And so there was a kind of pragmatic tradition within the Dutch Reformed Church as well, which one shouldn't forget.
Not all Boers were in favor of the war, and during the war many left the armed struggle and became hensoppers, who surrendered because of the promise by Lord Roberts that they could remain neutral and go back to their farms. The joiners were another category altogether. They were Boers who actively fought on the side of the British and were very useful because they knew the terrain and tactics of the Boers. Ultimately, there were about 5,000 joiners fighting on the British side, while there were about 17,000 Boers in the veldt. This means that to some extent a kind of civil war was also being fought. The joiners were particularly despised by other Boers.
They were mainly drawn from, and that's the class angle that comes into it, they were particularly drawn from bijwoners or tenants at will, poor whites, who saw the war as an opportunity. They were promised land after the war by the British. It was one way of inveigling them into the army, of convincing them to join up. They were promised land after the war, and particularly for bijwoners, this was a major issue. If you could join the army and get land after the war, that's a very good proposition. They also paid 5 shillings a day, which was not to be scoffed at the time.
In some cases, all the men of a family joined up, but there were also marked exceptions. A good example of this is the well-known Christian de Wet and his brother Piet de Wet. Christian de Wet was a well-known Boer general, but was urged by his brother in an open letter during the war to rather lay down arms and surrender. Piet de Wet was on the British side. Religious arguments were sometimes put forward by dissenting Boers to justify their becoming joiners.
They often use those type of arguments that God has already given us a sign that the British are destroying, the British army is destroying the country, the women are dying in the concentration camp. To them that was a clear God-given sign that God wants us to stop this war, else why would he allow these atrocities to continue? And the people, then they blamed the bitter enders for actually being responsible for that. After the war they were despised. The British didn't keep their promises that they would get land. They were put in a false position. Immediately war was declared. They had no say in the terms of the peace of Vereniging. They were excommunicated from the Dutch Reformed Church. They couldn't participate in Nagmaal, the Holy Communion, and until they confessed their sins, that they had done wrong during the war and they had to apologize, and only then were they accepted back into the fold. But some of them refused to do that, and it's at that point that they started up their own church.
Taken in the global context, the Boer War can seem an insignificant little contest at the bottom end of the world. But what happened in the 20th century proves that this was not the case at all.
Despite the fact that some historians of British imperialism say that it was a small war, it was still a war which changed the face of the empire and in fact marked the decline of British imperial power as the United States begins to emerge as the prime mover in the 20th century in terms of world politics.
The Boer War's legacies lie in different areas. For the Afrikaner, it meant that for a long time they had lost their independence. And this idea to get back their republics continued and became part of the Afrikaner national paradigm. Together with that, they could use the deaths of Boer women and children in the concentration camps and the heroism of the Boers on the battlefield. They could use that to promote Afrikaner nationalism, which became an aggressive Afrikaner nationalism, evolving into formal apartheid.
In the short term, the war inspired many of the Boers with a burning fervor to regain their independence. And immediately after the war, they started with a process to regain political power. This was achieved when South Africa became a union in 1910, but they did not yet have political independence. This desire led directly to the rebellion of 1914 and the Ossewa Brandwacht movement in the 1940s, when many of the Afrikaners refused to support Britain in the 2 world wars. Boer nationalism, which had gained momentum in the Anglo-Boer War, was finally realized in 1948 when the National Party gained power and finally led to the declaration of a Republic of South Africa in 1961. It was only with the elections in 1994